Welcome everybody to the January 2015 meeting of the Mississippi PowerShell User Group. Tonight we have Matt Gohmann, and he's going to be presenting on desired state configuration in practice. Matt is a deployment analyst at Netgain Technology, and his presentation is going to cover the components of DSC and how he's used it to automate the provisioning of client environments, along with some lessons learned and how you can create your own custom configurations and resources. So with that, take it away, Matt.
Great. Thanks, Ron. All right, so I'm going to start out with a little bit of motivational speaking here and some PowerPoint. And this will be very brief. So that's me. I'm Matt Gohmann, Deployment Analyst with Netgain Technology. Very briefly, we are a cloud hosting company that does EMR and EHR, electronic medical record or electronic health record hosting. I'm not going to be getting into that very much. What I'm primarily concerned about is automating Windows. So if you use Windows, if you administer Windows, you will probably want to know about desired state configuration. When you're working on Windows on a cloud scale, you can't be clicking. If you're clicking next through a lot of windows, you're not really doing it right. You're not able to scale your environment very quickly. So Microsoft has created a framework. This framework is conveniently enough called the Windows Management Framework, and that is Windows PowerShell. In the later versions of PowerShell, 3 and 4, we've got some great improvements, including desired state configuration. PowerShell 5 actually has the introduction of a lot more great features for desired state configuration. And why Microsoft is doing all of this is, of course, Azure. So Microsoft is not spending time clicking through menus on their operating systems and setting up services. They're creating configuration documents and then deploying that to their Azure cloud. And because they built this framework, they're also sharing this all with the rest of us Windows admins. So they've got this awesome framework to build out your cloud. Desired state configuration. My goal here is to give you an explanation of how does desired state configuration work, how have we managed to put it to work for us, and how you can get started using it. The kind of 3 things that you should keep in mind for desired state configuration is you've got a piece that is human readable, a document that defines your configuration that somebody with some PowerShell knowledge should be able to take a look at and figure out what it's doing. Then you have a configuration document that the computer can read, and this they call the Moth file. It's still fairly readable, but it's a little bit more arcane looking. And then you have an actual factory, or the underlying mechanics that gets things done. And I'm going to talk a little bit how that factory of DSC works. So the factory of DSC built into Windows, the Windows Management Framework, is this piece that controls DSC, runs the code, configures your Windows environment. And we've got 3 kind of main parts to this factory piece. First is the low-level machine that's actually doing the work. You've got a local configuration manager. So this is the actual service and the piece that's running on your Windows computer to be able to take the next pieces that we talk about and do something with it. It's the robot arm that's putting the piece together. Next, you've got a person who is actually creating instructions to move that robot arm and actually carry things out. So what you will do is you'll write a configuration document, or you might even write lower level things, which are the Dsc Resources, which define how that robot arm moves. So if that robot arm is supposed to move, to the right 5 feet, you write that in your resource. If it's to do something like attach a wheel to the car, that's kind of a higher level. That's a configuration, where the resource part is the instruction to move the arm and then attach the wheel. So there's the higher level abstract configuration that you're programming, and you can also, if you choose to, do the lower level. I'm exactly putting this wheel on here with the robot arm at this position. And then lastly, you need some means to distribute your instructions, your configuration, or your resources. And that is, if you can't really tell what my image is there is cables going into the robot from the programmer over there. So you have to have some means of getting those instructions, those configurations, those resources into that factory, that robot that's configuring things, the local configuration manager. And with PowerShell and Dsc, you've got two means of doing that. You have a push configuration or a pull configuration. I'm not going to go too much in depth on how to set either one of those up, but push configuration is the simplest means, where you'll just have a configuration on a computer and just tell it to execute. Pull, you're going to set up a server where you'll hold the configurations on that server, and then the mechanics of that robot will reach out to that server, pull down the instructions that you want to have there, and then start executing them. And so you build your whole environment there with those three kind of pieces. So recapping, that was the three pieces of this factory part. Starting back at the top, you've got a human readable piece, a configuration document that will be easily to read and understand, where you define what you want your car to look like, what you want your Windows Server to look like. It'll create a nice document for the machine to work on called the Moth file. And then here, the factory, on this lower level piece where the work is actually getting done, you've got the mechanical robot piece, the local configuration manager, which is a Windows service. You've got Dsc Resources, which are the specific instructions, like move the arm to the right 5 feet and then screw on the wheel, that kind of thing. And then you also have that means of getting the instructions to the robot. Then briefly, I just wanted to mention the common engineering criteria. So Microsoft has something that they call the common engineering criteria, and desired state configuration is slated to be part of that for a lot of Microsoft's products going forward. The good news about that for us in the PowerShell world is we'll see more and more products that support desired state configuration. So learning this today will set you up to be very happy with all the new products that Microsoft will be rolling out that supports this, and you'll be able to automate your cloud infrastructure much easier. That ends the motivational part of the talk, and now we get into some examples. So first, what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit, about a customer that I had before I show you this video here. I had a customer environment that was actually fairly simple, and I was looking at the project for that today, and we had to build them a domain, set up a few servers, set up SQL, set up IAS, very straightforward, pretty simple configuration. So I looked at the hours in that project, and it took approximately 15 hours to do the base infrastructure configuration of what we call it. We're getting the server set up, installing all the apps, and testing basic functionality. After we've implemented desired state configuration to build our servers, we actually have about a 4-hour time investment. It's slightly less than that, but we went from 15 hours to configure one Active Directory environment with a few SQL servers, IAS, to about 4 hours. And most of that 4 hours is just creating the documentation and probably getting the specifications right with the customer was most of that work. But so about a 4x increase for us on just one customer project. It has saved us a great deal of time when we're working on even larger scale projects. So here I'm going to show you the piece where we are using this to create the initial starting piece where we create the environment. So here what you're looking at is a video capture of my VMware infrastructure, and we have got some 4 virtual machines being created. We're using VMware PowerCLI to inject the desired state configuration, resources, the the Moth files, everything that we need for DSC to run on these machines is being injected into these machines. And I'll show you the code for that in just a minute. You'll see what I actually have going here is there's 4 machines, and we just use PowerShell jobs to execute these in parallel. And we're just waiting for these virtual machines to finish configuring. And the actual, let's fast forward a little bit here. Oh, get a little choppy on the video. I'll skip the video piece. What it's doing there is it's going to inject them and then invoke the DSC script. So you see this line here, invoke VM script. It first copies the files to the virtual machine and then starts the DSC configuration. What we're doing is a pull configuration, and we're doing this because in our environment we don't really have, we've got a more strict kind of security requirement where we can't have a single pull server that is able to be accessed for all of our client environments. So we have many different client environments, and really the one way that we have to get into them is to inject our DSC directly from the virtualization layer. So what that really looks like is, here is some PowerCLI where we add the VMware snap-in, connect to a vCenter server, and really just a few simple lines here. We first copy a file, which is, these are the Dsc Resources, and we copy them to the local machine. And then the next thing we do is we copy a Moth file, the MetaMoth, and then we invoke a VM script to set the local configuration manager. And then if we chose to apply that, here we actually copy the main Moth. So in that, on the slide where I talked about the machine readable piece, you have these Moth files. There's 2 Moth files, and I'll show you both of those in just a little bit. We just inject these 2 machine files into the virtual machine with the copy VM guest. And then we invoke a VM script to start the configuration manager. This is the robot arm piece, so it's actually starting to carry out the configuration. And then here, if you want to start the main part of the configuration, you invoke this piece here. So I'll share this code to allow you to invoke a DSC, both of the Moths and setting your modules into the virtual machine. That one will be available on the Mississippi PowerShell Users Group webpage after the presentation. So that gets the files into the machine, and it starts executing them. To show you the results and what we've done with our Dsc resources, I'll give you a little bit of the end result here. So we've created 4 machines like I talked about. We have an Active Directory domain controller, an RDS server, a dual-purpose file server and SQL server, and I actually had a 2008 R2 RDS server. It doesn't say the R2 on there, but that's 2008 R2. And so what we've done with our DSC resources that we've used Microsoft resources and custom written our own, is we create pretty much an entire client environment, Active Directory, setting DNS, setting all sorts of different pieces. So here I'm demoing, we've got Active Directory set up. I called it ngdemo1.local. I've got an OU structure created. Here are some computers that are joined to my domain. So you can see the ones I was talking about there are that's an RDS server that's been joined to the domain. There's nothing in our computers container. We've got 1 domain controller because we like to live dangerously. And we've got security groups that are created. And I'll show you, and I'll be able to share bits and pieces of this code here. Now here we've got DNS, setting that up. So that is all the DNS entries are in there properly. I'm going to fast forward a little bit. And then here I'm showing Active Directory, and we enabled the recycle bin through DSC. That's that piece there. Setting the firewall, we've got the firewall turned off on this server. Clicking over onto the RDS server, then I'll show you that we've got it's properly joined to the domain. Its IP configuration is set according to what we defined in our configuration document, and we've actually turned off IPv6. And that's all set according to what our standards were defined there. I show here that Internet Explorer has the, because this is an RDS server, the IE security turned off, and we get MSN. And that looks like something that I could also automate so that we ignore that, or add that to group policy. Here's our file server / SQL server. One of the things that I'll show you here is that we've got our page files we use different standards for page files for different types of roles, and we like to have them on a page file volume and set it according to the RAM size, according to different specifications. So that's been controlled. One of the things that we did is you can set the page file. I believe that the PowerShell community on GitHub, they've got a page file resource. We've also created our own to do a few more different pieces. I'll see if we can get a pull request to the community one to include some of the improvements that we've made. Because this was a file server, I show you here that I've created a share, a Netgain share there. And we've got a whole lot of volumes that were created, and they were all formatted by DSC properly. The SQL volumes were formatted with the 64K block size. We've also installed, we use a few different system tools. Catalogic DPX is our backup tool. We have antivirus installed. That was installed through DSC, different pieces there. And let's see, we can probably skip towards the end if I've got anything else here. I also show, I guess here are the Moth files. These are the things that were injected into this virtual machine. So you can see this is kind of the machine readable piece that the local configuration manager looks at to decide how to configure this machine. And here, actually, I show what I do as a extra safety measure. We both use a certificate to encrypt the passwords in the Moth, and Mike Robbins here has a great article on how you can get that to use a self-signed certificate. And we delete the password from the Moth too, just in case. So even though we've got it encrypted on the Moth, we also delete the password from that Moth file. But I keep the Moth file around just in case I want to take a look at the configuration of that machine later and compare it to the Moth to see what it should have been if something was amiss. So all that there, that's the end result. And that end result, the great thing about what you've just seen there, all those different configuration pieces, that has saved us in our technical documentation about 18 pages or so of configuration. So we went from having to read through and manually apply, say, about 18-ish pages of kind of manual steps, some of it semi-automated, some not. But we've taken 18 or so pages and got that down to a single document. So I'll show you what that document looks like. This is one of the pieces that I think will be semi-unique compared to how other people are using DSC. What I have is what we call a config data document. It's just a PS1 file. And in here we have, this is our friendly or our user-friendly document for looking at our configuration. So this is a hash table, which holds an array, which holds a hash table, which holds some more hash tables, and we feed this into our configuration script. The configuration script generates the Moth. So going back to those pieces that I was talking about, where you've got a user-friendly or readable document, and then a machine-readable document. This is our user-friendly document, so really anyone with a basic understanding for Windows administration should recognize all of these pieces. So we're, setting a variety of different components to our environment, setting if it was a new domain or an existing domain, and setting your network configuration here, setting a certificate to use, and then let me talk about this first, this top section here. So you'll see here I've got these multiple hash tables. We've got all nodes at this array and these hash tables. This top hash table section is for global settings. You'll see the node name here is star. When you've got something that's in this section here with the star, it adds all of these different properties to each individual node. So what this looks like is you've got this global piece, and then you have individual computers down here. So here was our domain controller. When this gets processed, it takes these global pieces and adds them to this individual piece. If you have something that's in this individual piece that's different from above, so let's say you've got the primary DNS for this one would be different, you can just add that line down here, and the individual computer will take precedence. So what you have here, this friendly document, you can set your global settings, everything that's going to be common across all of your machines in this friendly kind of format where you've got a hash table with a key or property and the value you want that property to be set to. And we just feed that into our config script. One other thing that I'll mention here is that we are cloning this object multiple times. We use this for the LCM config data and for our what we call the VM config data. We pass this into multiple scripts, and when you have this a hash table with other hash tables inside of it, when you make changes when this is running, these are linked. So if you would, as it's running, if you change something here, it will change it in the other ones. So we have to serialize this, and I'll share this. I'll maybe have to write a little bit something about why I do this more, but it's these multiple hash tables. When we create multiple hash tables, if we wouldn't be cloning this and serializing this object, they would be still linked to each other, and you would get your configuration data could be changed in a way that you don't expect. So long story short, you get this feeds into our configuration document. So this is the configuration script, and how this works is we've got some parameters that we accept at the top, and a hidden parameter, I guess, that you don't really see is that configuration data. You have the node here, and then we've got, so I was talking about how you have a general section over here, like the global settings section, and then you have specific pieces for a machine. Over here, we have pretty much the same thing. We have a region for general config. So every machine that we have that gets built has these features installed. So like the RSAT tools, Active Directory, it's enabled RDP. We activate Windows. We do a variety of things. Make sure that the firewall service is running, set a time zone, things like that. So we've got this general config that's going to get applied to every machine. Then we have what we call a server role. So usually when we're building out a machine, we'll give it a role, and it might even have multiple roles, such as a SQL server and a file server, or IAS and SQL. We actually have a property that we store here, and we've got server role. So this one is a 2012 R2 domain controller, a primary domain controller. And this, basically what you're looking at here is I've just used an if statement to match my role. So if it is matching a primary domain controller, we set the configuration so it's the primary domain controller. So when you're building out, this is your configuration document. This is what actually replaced the 18 or so pages of configuration. When I want to build out a domain controller, and it's a primary domain controller, I want these pieces installed. So I want to install the ADDS feature. I want to create the domain. So there's the domain creation happening right there. And I would do some other things. When you're a primary domain controller and you are 2008 R2, we do some different things versus if you're 2012 R2. So basically it's just whether we use some of the built-in resources or we have some of our own. So here the Netgain AD domain controller, this is a custom written resource that creates this as a domain controller because under 2008 R2 the Microsoft resource doesn't actually work for that. So if you have 2012, we go ahead and use the full Microsoft piece. If you are on 2008 R2, then we'll just use the one that we've written. So the idea here is that you've got your configuration in this friendly document here that's kind of easy-ish to read, where you define your whole set of configuration. This gets fed into this script, which has just basic logic in it that if it's a certain role, you add these features to that configuration. If it would carry multiple roles, it's going to actually just do that just fine. It's going to be able to see that it's matching, that it's a file server, matching that it's Exchange, matching that it's SQL, and just add these other configuration pieces as it goes. When that's all said and done, you've defined all of these configurations. It outputs a Moth file. So that is our giant configuration document, somewhat stripped down, and how we feed it in. So a friendly document that gets fed into a configuration script, which is basically our entire procedure for how we should want that server configured. It spits out that Moth file, and then we inject that Moth file into the virtual machine. It carries it out, and we've got a virtual machine that's configured the way that we want it. So that's the overview of how we do that. We do have a few pieces that are slightly different than maybe average. One thing that will be in the future, this logic where I've got the different server roles matching, based on if it's one thing or the other. In PowerShell version 5, this will all be obsolete because you will be able to break out the configurations into maybe somebody can get me the correct term, what they call that in PowerShell 5, where you don't actually have to split it out, or you can split out your configuration so you have one configuration for a domain controller and one configuration for a file server. It's going to be far simpler in the future, so maybe somebody in the chat knows the name that they have for that.
That's not what they call composite.
Yep. Yeah, you'll be able to have a composite of your configuration where it'll contain all the different pieces. So you can build one shorter document. This is actually a subsection or subset of our configuration document. Our actually main configuration document is around 700 lines. So I just cut some stuff out that didn't really need to be there to show. But yeah, when you are able to do those composite configurations, you can have a far simpler set of code where you've got, you don't have to do this server match. You just say, oh, I'm just grabbing that file server composite config, and I smash that together with my SQL Server config, and you're happy. So this is basically a workaround until PowerShell 5 gets out. One other thing, actually, while I'm in here to mention, is because this is a PowerShell script, you can use all of the nice code logic that you rely on. So what I have here is kind of a simple piece here. Multi depends on this variable is if you are a 2012 domain controller. So this one's a 2012 domain controller if you're in this section. So you your if statement and your else if, you've matched that you're a 2012 domain controller. I set my dependency to be on this resource. So this is the Microsoft Active Directory domain controller resource. So that is different if we were the 2008. It would be using this Netgain domain controller resource. So think about this when you're building out your configuration. It doesn't have to be a simple flat document that you just define one big long list of what you exactly want. You can build logic into it, even simple stuff like this where, yes, I'm a 2012, so I get to use this one, which is great. So then I'll just set my dependencies. So I'm now dependent on this resource. I probably should explain how dependencies work a little bit. When you're building out your configuration, you will obviously need to have Active Directory installed before you actually create your domain. So your dependencies will vary if you're building a 2012 domain controller versus a 2008 domain controller. So think about that when you're building your config script. If you want to depend on something, you can use you're already the tools that you know, the logic to change your configuration kind of on the fly as you're doing it. All right, so that's basically how we do that with Netgain. We create this nice friendly document which we'll let everybody kind of look at and edit. We feed it into here, it generates them off. So what I'm going to do next is show you some really awesome resources that we've used to kind of help create our resources, create our configurations in an easier manner. So you'll be able to do a lot of this on your own and take advantage of these great things. So first is Alexander Nikolic from PowerShell Magazine, a PowerShell MVP, has an awesome article that I think should be viewed more. He has a tip here, how to use the Snippets feature in PowerShell ISE to give you the syntax for your Dsc resources. So, and I'll have a link to this at the end of the talk too. But what you do is you've got this little bit of code here. We'll create snippets for you. We'll just go and paste that and go new Dsc snippet. When you run this, what it does is it scans all of the Dsc resources that are installed on your system, and it creates snippets for you in the ISE. This can actually take a little bit of time to run, so let's see if I can stop it. I've already run this earlier, so we'll go back over here and show you actually how they work. When you right click and you use the usual start snippets, you have all of these different Dsc resources that are showing now. So let's say you wanted to learn how the syntax of the configuration for let's say the Firefox resource. you now can insert that, and you have a little bit of a cheat sheet for when you're building out your resource, or you're building out your configuration. And how you read this is you'll just see these are the different properties that are available and what you can put into them. So you'll actually have to edit this, so it would be something like depends on, oops, oh, my autocomplete is not good there. The other, so you would just modify this. This just gives you a nice easy view to look at when you want to see what's in a resource. Let's take another quick look at another one here. So the user resource is a great one. So you have a username. This one's excellent here because you can see this line is different. This is a required property for that. And then these other ones are optional. So these are optional, and it takes potentially an array of strings. So you saw in my configuration earlier that I could depend on multiple resources. So this can just give you an idea on how to structure your configuration document to make sure that you have all of your resources covered. So check that out. It's on PowerShell magazine. It is the Dsc Snippets. It can just help you make your resources easier. All right. Next, I'm going to show you a little bit more of that nitty-gritty and how to write it for your own resources and how that LCM works too. So here we're going to create our own resource. We're going to do a new DSC resource, and it's going to be a relatively simple one. And we're going to create that resource using the Dsc Resource Designer tool. This is in the Microsoft Dsc Resource Kit. It's part of the Resource Kit, which includes all of the many great resources that Microsoft has written, all 9 waves that they've created so far. Many great features they've added there. But what you do when you want to create something with the Dsc Resource Designer is there's 2 commands to learn, and they're both very straightforward, really. You have resource properties, and you have a resource itself. And let's create we're going to be creating a quick resource that sets our time zone. And so our Dsc resource has a property called time zone, and its attribute is key, and it's a string. And I actually like to have a validate set. You'll see here that I've got all of the US time zones, also UTC, because I want to validate that. I'm choosing a US time zone. And so here we first start by just adding or creating this property, putting it into this variable here. So there, we've just run that. And then we'll create the Dsc resource. So this is your first step in writing your own resource to manage your time zone on your machine. So we'll run that one. What that has done is it's done the hard work of creating a new Dsc resource and its various bits and pieces that that you really don't want to think about if you don't have to. What it does is it creates a folder. In the folder you have a manifest or a file, and you've got another folder which contains a Moth file and a PowerShell script, where your PowerShell module script that's going to do the actual work. So back at the start, when I was talking about this is in the factory, you are now programming that robot to carry out the task. So we want to carry out the task of setting our time zone properly. When we've used the Dsc Resource Designer toolkit from Microsoft, it creates the folder structure. It creates this folder structure that is properly formatted for a resource. It has the manifest. It has the Moth files. One of the more troubling things if you try to create a Moth yourself by hand. It is very picky on formatting. So when I started out, I started trying to create Moth files by hand, and trust me, it's a lot easier if you just use the Dsc Resource designer to create the Moth file for you, and it will properly set all these things, like setting your validate set to have this value map there, and here at the end it shows you, okay, it's a type is string, and your variable name is time zone. It does all the heavy lifting for you, and you also get this PowerShell module file, which we'll take a look at now. So here, this is the one that was just created. It gives you some tips on how to write your Dsc resource. Your Dsc resources contain 3 parts. The 3 parts of the Dsc resource are the get, the set, the test. They basically, whenever you're running the local configuration manager and you want to carry out something with that resource, so you want to set the time zone, it's going to run through these in an order here. It's actually kind of reverse order. It's going to first run the test. So it's going to say, I am in the central time zone. Test this out for me, or I want to be in the central time zone. Test this out for me and see if I actually am in the central time zone. If I am not, so it returns a false, I am not in the central time zone, it's going to run the set. So it sets it and says, okay, change this to the central time zone. When this is done, it is just going to run this again. So this is the guts of it. DSC, the services, all these scripts that you're writing, it's just running this service to run a PowerShell script to say, hey, is this the way I want it, true or false? If it's false, let's try and set it. And then we'll test it again to see if we got what we wanted. That's really at the core all DSC is doing. And then lastly, we do have a get target resource, and this is basically for informational. If you set up a pull server and you just want to use this to report on what you're doing, see if, is my server in the central time zone, I can just get that. And I might be set to Pacific time zone. I can get that information back, store it on my central server, and check that out. So what we're going to do now is we are going to create this resource. So we've got our 3 pieces here, and because time zone is a relatively simple one, this should look fairly familiar. We're just going to erase that, and we'll copy my really simple code. So tzutil, you can run PowerShell commands in Dsc Resources. You can run old school command prompt commands. They all still work. So we'll just paste this line right there. So this built our parameters from the resource designer, so this is all formatted nicely. We know that it wants to return a Boolean, so I do have it returning a Boolean here. We're just evaluating. tzutil is running and getting the time zone. That's the /G there. And if your time zone was you wanted it to be central time, and it returns central time, you're evaluating that there, it'll give you back a true or false. So that's our test part. Let's say you want to set it. Well, you use tzutil with the /s, and you've got your time zone parameter there. We'll put that in the set portion. So there, we'll set that. And the get portion, this is just kind of a hack here. I'm writing output of a hash table. It has to return a hash table, so I've just got send a hash table out here with time zone and then the value. So this is our resource. All very simple stuff that if you've been PowerShelling very much at all, you should be able to create your own resource to use maybe even a tool that you've got in your environment, maybe a custom tool. You can create a Dsc resource to get that done really easily. So I'll just save that. Let's see.
Hey, Matt, we had a question in the chat from Wahid. He
Yeah.
asked, does Git always need to return a hash table?
It does, actually. I think it's probably just from the fact that Microsoft probably wants to format that nicely when you're kind of pulling all those reports. So you do actually always have to have it be a hash table. And you'll see here when you're creating your properly formatted resource with the Resource Designer tool, it gives you this and it tells you, yeah, my output type here has to be a hash table. And you'll see that the test has to be a Boolean. So when you're going to write some more complex scripts than this, make sure that the only thing that you're outputting is in the test part, your only thing you're outputting is the Boolean, and the only thing that you're outputting up in the getter here is a hash table with the results that you want to be including there. And you'll see the set one doesn't actually have any required output because it doesn't really look at this output. It just runs that, and then it will validate that you actually did this properly by running this piece. So I've got my simple time zone resource all created here. It's all properly formatted thanks to the Resource Designer, and I've got that saved. So we'll go over here. So I've just had this in my documents, and I've got that resource folder. Here we've got the time zone resource that we just created. We'll copy that. And your resources that you create, you're always going to want to put them in this folder, which is C, Program Files, Windows PowerShell, Modules. This is where you'll copy in your resources. So here, I'm just going to put my time zone resource in there. So you can see these are the files that we just created. Just modified those. And it's got all the stuff that we expect there. We can close these out. All right, so this is one part of that factory. This is you programming the robot to set up the time zone the way that you want it. The next piece to this is you need to have some means to actually give the robots the instruction to do that and set your time zone. So we have the underlying mechanics of move that arm, robot arm, and do something. Well, now you have to tell it what you actually want it to do. So we've got two pieces to that left to cover. You've got a configuration that configures the actual robot. This is the local configuration manager portion. And then you have the configuration for what you're setting in your environment. So you'll see this is the bit that you're probably more concerned about. This is where you're setting your time zone properly. And this is where you're controlling your robot. How is the robot actually working? And we'll take a look at what this piece actually does here. So your local configuration manager is that service that's running on your system, and it has a few different settings that you might want to change. One of those being that method that it receives the instructions. So that method here, we've got a push configuration. If you had a central server that you were going to pull the information from, you would just change this to pull, and then you would have to give it some more information on where to actually pull it from. But we'll change that back to push. So this is controlling our local configuration manager mechanism. We want it to apply and autocorrect. So from here, there are a few different options, one of them being apply and I forget what it's called, just pretty much apply once. This one is apply and autocorrect. So what this will mean is every 15 minutes, my local configuration manager service is going to run my script to check to see if I'm in the central time zone. Or actually maybe refresh frequency is 30 minutes. I don't know. Well, it's going to check every interval that you provide, and if it would drift your configuration, so somebody changed it from Central Time over to Pacific Time, it is going to fix that for you when you're in the Apply and Autocorrect mode. If you were in Apply Once mode, it's going to do what it describes there. It's just going to apply it once, and somebody later on changes it to Pacific Time. You're now set in Pacific Time, and it's not going to care about that. You can also have the configuration do a kind of monitoring or reporting mode. So if it'll look through your configuration, see, hey, I'm in the Pacific Time zone, and it might send it back, or you might see a report on your central server that, hey, this server is supposed to be in the Central Time, and now it's actually in Pacific Time. It won't make any changes, but that might be a way to kind of monitor your configuration. So to show you what my configuration on this machine is right now, I'm going to run this command. So there's the get local configuration manager. So here is my current setup. I've got a frequency of 1440 minutes there. It's apply and monitor, and push mode is there. So I'm going to change that. So I'm going to give my factory the different instructions. So what we'll do here, I've just defined configuration. I've called it LCM. You can actually call this whatever you want. My node that I'm going to apply it to is, I'm using that, this is the hostname command line tool to just throw my hostname in there. And we're defining that I want it to be changed to apply an autocorrect and a 15-minute interval. And, oh, this is an important one. Reboot if needed true. In our environment, once I've set up the configuration the way that I want, and the initial setup is done, I change this to false because I don't want it, even if somehow somebody would change my configuration. So I'm now in Pacific time zone, and let's say the setting time zone was something that actually required you to reboot the machine. I don't want that rebooting during the day when somebody might be using that server and relying on it. Just maybe change it, but don't reboot. Don't impact service. So we're just going to run this bit here. And what that did just now is create a Moth file. That Moth file is that machine readable instruction that I was talking about. That's how the local configuration manager actually looks at this stuff in the Moth file format. Then we're going to actually apply it. So we'll take a quick look at the Moth file. So here I've got it. I just stored it on C Moths. Here's my machine, and it has a meta Moth. These are the settings that I want my local configuration manager to be. So I've got it set for push mode, reboot, or frequency 15 minutes, apply an autocorrect, and reboot if needed. So this is the format that it likes it in, and now we will actually set that. So far, it's still in the don't reboot and 1440 minutes configuration until you actually set it. So now we've set it. How it set it is it read that Moth file, applied those settings, and now we can double check that it actually did. So here we can see now we're back to a 15-minute interval, and reboot if needed is true, and that's exactly what we wanted. So all that was to just get our robot to perform the way that we wanted, which is go ahead, reboot me, go ahead and update every 15 minutes. Next, we're going to actually change our time zone. So I'm in the central time zone. This machine is actually set to Pacific time zone right now. And using those resources, that resource that we just created, here is a configuration. So This matches up to my many hundreds of line configuration here. So this is the same thing, but in a very smaller scale. We're only changing one individual piece of the configuration on this machine. So the anatomy of this is we have the configuration keyword, what we're calling it. We're importing the resources that we want to use. So we have one resource that we're going to use, and it's called time zone. We're applying it to my computer. And what are we going to apply? We're going to use the time zone. And this part, you can call this almost whatever you want. We're setting the time zone, just something descriptive. And here's the actual part where we're providing the parameter. You want time zone to be Central Standard Time. And then we run the config, and it will spit out a Moth file for us. So here we now have a Windows 2015 Moth file. So out in this folder, we've got the MetaMoth, the guts of controlling how the local config manager runs and what you actually want to do with it. So this is usually the more important piece. What am I actually going to do with this thing? And this is this machine readable piece. And the only line that really is telling us something interesting is what I want it set to, and that's Central Time. So now we're going to have my machine actually do this. So remember, we're in the Pacific time zone. And we'll go back to that in a second here. So now we're actually going to tell it to do this configuration. So we'll start the DSC configuration, go into this folder, and run that right now with the force. And the wait here will just allow us to watch it as it runs, which there really isn't much to watch, but we should be in Central Time now. So there we go. We've just created a new properly formatted resource using the Dsc Resource Designer. We've put it in the right spot, which is Program Files, Windows PowerShell Modules. We've created these Moth files, and we've executed the Moth files, and we actually had it carry out a configuration that we wanted to. So there you go. There's not much more to it than that. Just think about how you want to write your resources. If it's something that hasn't ever been done yet, go ahead, write your own. You can, we didn't have a resource for installing our antivirus, so we just use the command line tools that were provided, and we have them test things out to see if they're right. If you're not, just set them. That's really all there is to it. You create your resources, you create your Moths, and you push them out to your machine, and you have a nicely configured environment. Let's see. And if you guys have any questions, I can go into more detail on specifics to my environment. Looks like I'm actually at about an hour, so we can take further questions if you want to see something in more detail, or if I didn't cover something very well, let me know. Here are some resources for you to get started if you're interested in learning more about DSC. If you're getting going, it really is as simple as creating just some scripts, putting them in the right spots, and executing them. But I've got a Microsoft Cura page here where you can get a quick access to these. I recommend the DSC book. This will explain a lot more depth on the nitty-gritty of how these things actually work, including the pull server. I didn't really get into that because I actually don't use it because I just inject them with PowerCLI. Then we've got the PowerShell.org Git repository. Check out all those awesome resources from the people in the community. The PowerShell.org itself, the main website, has links to other great resources. Microsoft has been writing amazing resource kits. They're up to their Wave 9 right now, and there's so many of these, so many different pieces. In fact, the time zone that we just created, Microsoft released that in Wave 9, although they don't have validation, and I liked the validation from my piece, so I showed you that there today. But there's all sorts of great resources. You don't have to write this stuff if Microsoft has already written it for you. And then I do recommend checking out those snippets from PowerShell Magazine. That can just help you understand how that all actually works there. Oh, thank you. Assume the base images have PowerShell 4. Yeah, so you do have some prerequisites. PowerShell 4 must be installed on all of your base templates. So I had a Windows 2008 R2 box and a 2012 R2 box, or 3 2012 R2 boxes that I configured. You do have to have that installed, but really that's about it, because what I'm doing with my setup is injecting the other pieces that I need through PowerCLI. I inject the resources that I want by copy VM guest file, and then I inject the Moth files that I want to use, and then I just tell it to execute them. So I've got no other requirements other than just getting PowerShell properly there, and just executing that. The SharePoint DSC resource. I don't know anything about the SharePoint DSC resource. I think they're actually, yeah, does Microsoft have one? I think they do. Oops. Do they have something? This is the everything, so if we have SharePoint in here, doesn't look like it. The good news is, since this is probably going to be added to the common engineering criteria, if there's not very good PowerShell support for SharePoint, it probably will be in a future release of SharePoint. I'm not actually a SharePoint admin, and I've not used it since like version 2007. So I don't know too much about how that actually is at its current state. But if they have good PowerShell support, I would not be surprised if Microsoft or someone in the community will release something in the future. Oh, they don't. Zen Desktop. Yeah, you know what? I did see Citrix had a blog post with the they actually made a DSC resource, but I think, yeah, it was a Zen Desktop DSC resource. I do a bit with Citrix XenApp, but I don't know if they have how good their command support is for that. If you had, if they have really good coverage, go ahead and use the DSC Resource Designer to set up your tests, your set, your get, and you can write something on your own. If it's setting something, oh, they do have something here. Oh, Zen Desktop. So yeah, you know, it looks like, you know, this might be a start for Citrix, getting Zen Desktop support for DSC resources. I, you know, wouldn't be that surprised if they have good coverage on the XenApp side of things, that they will write something in the future. And if they don't write it, if you've got commands that are able to do what you need them to do, go ahead and write it yourself, because yeah, if you can just format it in the test set get, you should be able to do that. Oh. So setting up licensing can be done through their Dsc resource. You can see here, this is a really nice condensed example of a configuration. You have the name of your configuration. You're importing the resource that they have there. Oops. The name of the node. They're setting the local config manager piece here to reboot if you need to. They're setting a file. This is using the built-in file resource. Then they're unzipping using the built-in archive resource. And then they're using that their own Citrix Zen desktop role piece to change their configuration there. And they're then actually setting the config manager and applying it there. This is the start DSC configuration. It's taken the Moth that it would have generated and actually applying that. So that's a really nice, another condensed example. Hopefully a lot of that was of some use to you. I wanted to kind of share from the get-go that it is a little bit complicated in parts, but it doesn't really have to be that complicated when you think about it. Use the tools that are out there. You can create your own resources. If you can write a script that are able to return, test things, return a Boolean, set things the way that you want them. If that coverage is already there, you can create a resource for it. Your configuration script can include logic if you want to include different, like an if, an else, or a switch, or match on different characteristics of a configuration that you feed into it. Go ahead and use that. It's there. Feed in those Moths. If you're on VMware, you can send in your Moth files using the invoke VM script, or copy VM guest file and invoke VM script. So yeah, there's lots of great ways to use this. All right. Thanks everyone. Mike or Ron, if you want to jump in here, I don't know what kind of cutoff we want to look at for things.
Yeah. Just want to tell you that I really appreciate you speaking for us, and this was a really good topic. I picked up quite a number of tips. I've actually got a blog article on creating Dsc resources. I created a Dsc resource for configuring jumbo frames on network cards. So it's pretty much a step-by-step. So I'll post a link to that in the chat. And Microsoft's actually got several articles as well. So if you go out and take a look at those articles, and it's kind of like Matt was saying, you've just got to, it's actually not that difficult. You just have to spend a little time look at somebody else's example, and you've just got a query to test if something is in the state you want it to be in, and then return true or false for that, and then write the code to set it, and then also to get it. And it's, in the structure of the file system, you have to have that right. But it's not really that complicated, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I agree. Hopefully my goal of explaining this in a way that made sense and encourages you, go ahead, try this out. It's really not that bad. And they've got great tools. There's lots of great articles. Mike has stuff. I know, looked at his certificate one. Check that out. Don't put your passwords in plain text on disk. Check out Mike's article there, even for when you're trying things out. Yeah.
I'll post a link in the chat for that one as well.
All right. Well, yeah, that was an awesome presentation. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Ron. All right.
Okay. Well, is there any other questions anybody had, or it'll probably take us maybe a week to get the video posted. It'll be on the Mississippi PowerShell user group website. it'll be embedded in a new blog article. So, like I said, it'll be about a week. But thank you guys for attending, and we meet every month, and this year we're trying to go back to having like guest speakers. So we meet on Patch Tuesday, which is the second Tuesday of every month at 8:30 p.m. Central Time. Let me post a link to our Twitter account, because we always tweet everything out also. Like when the video is available, it would be tweeted out, when we're meeting, all that sort of stuff.
That is my Twitter. I don't really tweet much, so if you want to follow me, go ahead. And I will get Mike all of the resources, the scripts that I can share. I will send Mike, and when he posts that in a week or so, I'll make sure that he's got all my links and resources there.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up if there's no more questions. And thank you again, Matt, for presenting tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Really good job.